Hello friends, for today's video I want to go through a list of some adult fantasy books that have little to no romance. In making this list, I want to be very clear about a few things. First off, in no way am I trying to imply that books that have little to no romance are better than books that do contain romance within them. I think all kinds of human interaction and relationships are really important to examine, as they not only speak to very personal things that are within our lives, but also they can speak to bigger societal issues. I think a perfect example of a book that displays this is something like Sword of Kaigen, where issues of propaganda are shown by exploring a relationship between a mother and her son. And then an example of a book that does something similar, but of course isn't necessarily fantasy, would be The Vanishing Half. The Vanishing Half shows generational trauma and impacts of racism through a relationship between two sisters, and also these women's relationships to their children. And I do think that all kinds of relationships are worth exploring, whether they be romantically driven or they're something separate, like familial relationships, sibling bonds, friendships, so on and so on. At the end of the day, though, there are entire subgenres or genres dedicated to having an emphasis on romances in stories, and so sometimes it can be a little bit harder to find ones that don't necessarily have a romance as the main type of relationship that is being explored, or sometimes maybe you're not even looking for that more intimate exploration of human relationships. You more so are looking for bigger societal things, or you don't mind if there's a romantic subplot, but you do want to explore other things within your stories. And so by having there already be an entire genre and subgenre dedicated to romantic relationships, I did want to highlight some stories where that's not necessarily the main focus. Also, I like doing these in combination on occasion with when I do the good, the bad, and the smutty video series, because I am primarily a fantasy reader, and so on occasion I'll dip my toes in fantasy romance and contemporary romance to, as noted, kind of juxtapose that to the other kinds of stories that we get. And so this is somewhat of a sister video to that. That will either have just recently gone up or will go up shortly after this video. One last thing to note before we jump into the books themselves today. When I say little to no romance, my main thing that I'm trying to articulate here is that it is not in any way the main focus of the story. It is not the thing that is pushing the plot forward. So as an example, we have a couple of books today where we actually have characters that are married, but the book isn't about falling in love and getting married. That just happens to be a relationship that exists within the story. Truly, these are stories where that is not necessarily the catalyst for any of the big plot pieces. They just happen to either be in the background or they're not there at all. On that note, we'll officially jump into it and kick things off with The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi. First off, having the word adventures in the title is perfect because it really captures the feeling of the story. It truly is adventurous, but then also it speaks to our titular character, Amina, who has had many adventures. And it does kind of speak to who she is in that she's a little bit later in her life. She has a daughter, she's gone on many adventures, and she has that call back to that life she had before. She loves her daughter more than anything in the world, but she also has a calling to going on these quests and exploring more of the world. And maybe there's something about the danger of it all, the appeal of something new. And she's got one last job that she might do in order to provide a future for her and her daughter and to have a little bit more of a safety net. She really wants to give the daughter everything she possibly can. So she accepts this one last adventure, and maybe there's way more in store for her than she was ever anticipating. I will say I was a little bit nervous when I picked this one up because fun adventure stories with kind of the rakish character doesn't always work for me, or at the very least, even if it is fun, I often find I'm not as compelled or moved by these stories, but I really feel like this one utilized the adventure story extremely, extremely well. I was gripped by it. I really wanted to root for Amina. I can't wait for the sequel that's going to be coming out soon. She really is a very likable main character, and I think her being a little bit older than your typical protagonist, it just spoke to, not only because the point of this video is stories where, you know, the romance isn't necessarily as big of a thing, and that's a little bit rare these days. On top of that, older protagonists are not as common. I've done entire videos dedicated to stories with actual adult characters, and Amina I have brought up in that other video series. I'll have all the videos I've done in that video series linked in case you're interested. But so much about her character is very different from our usual protagonist. It's not a coming of age story. It's not a person who's having their eyes open to the world. It's somebody who's been there, done that. They're kind of tired of it. Sometimes they kind of miss it. Their knee hurts also. There's just a lot about her that makes her really rootable, really likable, and I thought that the story was an absolute blast. Next up is a book that didn't quite work for me, but if you don't know, I recommend books even if they fit my tastes or don't, just because we all do have such different things that work with us, that we resonate with. Regardless though, that book would be The Raven Scholar. Even though it didn't really work for me, it worked for so many people. So there's already a pretty decent chance that it will work for you. And this was a little bit of a darling last year when it came out. If you know nothing about it, it is very much a genre bender in that it's fantasy and murder mystery. We have at the beginning of the story, first off, really, really fascinating lore, but there's mystery with the lore because you're wondering what in that is true and what's not. And then we also have at the beginning somebody who has died, but then you're also wondering, did they die? And you're constantly trying to piece that together. Then, in present day, there is a trial that's going to occur because there are groups of houses, and there's a person that's going to represent each of these houses or areas of study, you can think of them as. And they are going to compete to become the next ruler. However, there is a murder that occurs for the House of the Raven right before the trials begin. And our main character, who's very scholarly, doesn't really want anything to do with the trials, isn't prepared for them, she ends up having to take the place of the person who was just murdered to represent her house. So you have a trials plotline, you have deep fantasy lore, and a murder mystery. There's a lot going on within this story. It flies by, and it's extremely packed with so much within it, which is why I think so many people really enjoy it. There is a romantic subplot in the story, but to emphasize again, that is not the main point of the book whatsoever. I think it just has a level of realness to it that, yeah, people oftentimes have intimate relationships in their lives. It has so much, though, within it that if you like genre benders, if you like murder mysteries, if you like deep lore within stories, and if you like the House Wars feeling, the trials feeling, then there's a decent chance that this one will work for you. Also, I will say that even though this one isn't motivated by the romance component, it read to me similar to how fantasy romance books read. So if you are somebody who tends to read fantasy romance and you want to get more into fantasy, I actually feel like this would be a really good one, as I do think that there are some parallels to the way it utilizes its tropes and how it is paced and written. For the next two books, I had mentioned before that a couple of the books today actually have married characters, and it's true for both of these. We have Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, as well as A Natural History of Dragons. I'll start with A Natural History of Dragons. This one has, in my opinion, aptly been compared to Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. The difference, I would say, is that I think that the main character of A Natural History of Dragons is more so like Helena from Justice of Kings. I know that's not going to mean anything to some people, but if you read Justice of Kings, you know what I mean, which is to say that this main character is telling you her life story, and she's starting with when she was very, very young, and when she was very, very young, she was kind of ignorant and stupid. And it's very aggravating because there are moments where you want to root for her, and there are moments where you want her to break out of the lack of agency she has as a woman within this more Regency era setup, this setting, but sometimes she is a little much and you get really frustrated with her. However, I do think it's realistic to show characters like this even when it is irritating, and I think by having it be through the lens of the character in present day telling you, there is this acknowledgement like, I know I was foolish. They'll acknowledge it on page, so you're like, okay, so you get it. And I think that that little bit does help make it easier to get into, and also it allows for character growth, which is really important because showing where characters start versus how they get to certain places is something that's always good to be in the habit of and practice of. It builds empathy, it reminds us of what it was like when we were younger, or even how we can look at ourselves now and be like, what could I learn from this? Point is, though, that we do have a character that she can be a little much, but if you don't know anything about the story, she is somebody who really has a fascination with the study of dragons. She's always wanted to learn more about them, and her husband go on this expedition to this very rural area to see if they can learn more about them. And within their world, it's very much kind of like our world, except the dragons exist, and also the dragons are very much like animals. They're not really treated like these magical beings. Everything about them, from their breath or the way that they utilize the environment around them, is more so attached to how animals behave, and you can almost think of them as these interesting birds. I do think that the cover makes it seem as though dragons have died out and they're trying to learn about them. That's not necessarily true at all. They exist in present day and they're trying to learn about them, which is where I think that the comparisons to Emily Wilde make a lot of sense, and our main character has an academic kind of studious nature to her. As for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, every time I talk about this, I don't quite know how to tell you about it because it is very different from a lot of things. It feels like a massive collection of short stories with one overarching antagonist / plotline. The setup is that you follow these two men, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, as you might expect, and they have brought magic back to England. Technically, Mr. Norrell has, but Jonathan Strange at times is almost like an apprentice, an ally, at times is kind of like an enemy, at times they are colleagues, at times they are just really snippy with each other, and their roles in each other's lives shift and are reshaped and reforged, and they have to work together to try and push back against this greater threat of this being who wants to use magic in ways that they are trying to learn more about. And I don't want to say too much else about that, but it is exceptionally meandering. It embraces what it is, and what it is a story that will over describe almost every encounter, everything, every scene, but intentionally so. And there's a lot of snark, there's a lot of dryness, there's a lot within the actual writing itself that's very funny. It just leans back and embraces the snark, and it does it continuously. If you like anything about what I described this as, then there's a chance that this one will work for you. And then last for today, we have the Poet Empress. I wanted to save this one for last so that I could touch on something briefly that I feel is important to acknowledge, which is that some of you have informed me that this one has been in some areas marketed as fantasy romance. It, in my opinion, absolutely is not fantasy romance. In no way is this a I can't wait till they get together kind of book. It is very much the opposite of that. So you have the setup of the story, a young woman who, from the time she was young, has experienced extreme hardship thanks to poverty. And she has the opportunity, as she is growing into a young woman, to offer herself up as a concubine to the rulers of their kingdom. And she decides to go through with this so that hopefully she can provide some level of stability or even something as basic as food to her family, to her village, and maybe other families and other villages as well. However, once she enters into the political realm, the person that she is meant to become a concubine to is an absolutely horrible, terrible person. They are an abuser. They are a monster. They seem to enjoy causing physical harm and pain to other people. They seem to either take pleasure in violence or feel absolutely nothing in enacting it. And she is trying to not only deal with the fact that by being a concubine and having proximity to a powerful person, it puts a target on her back. Not only is she trying to navigate that, but she's also trying to figure out how to endure all of the abuse that he puts onto her, just so that she can try to figure out how she can take advantage of the power he does have, and her original goal, send hopefully some kind of food and money and resources back to the people that need it. And she is a really compelling character. She also is somebody who is trying to acknowledge a monstrous system that continues to create monstrous people, while also looking at the child that perhaps the person used to be and what happened to them and how do they go from being an innocent child into something so sinister and awful and dark, and also not lose herself along the way. I thought it was very well done. It was very powerful. I really don't agree with the idea that this is fantasy romance, because I think that gives a completely wrong impression not only of the book, but also it puts onto the book something that it is not even trying, I think, to be. I think it's trying to tell a very different story than what that label would put onto it. It's very good though, and it's very heavy, so just kind of a heads up, if you are going to go into this one, you will definitely be seeing a lot of dark content within it. I have done a few different other versions of this video, so if you're interested in more recommendations beyond just the ones I mentioned today, I will have those linked, as well as I will have linked the videos where I talk about adult fantasy books with actual adult characters. And if you are somebody who does like romance within your fantasy stories. I'll have links to some of my fantasy romance themed videos. If you have any of your own recommendations though, feel free to leave them. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.